I thought that we would start to see respect for teams winning and most importantly, not losing through 8 games. Like we are 8 games of the way through the season. There is only a month left for a lot of these teams. And yet, we are still giving preferential treatment to the teams that come in. And I get all the time, I'm like, oh, you just hate the SEC. The SEC has a lot of those brands, but it happens across college football. It's not just in the SEC. Ohio State, for example, did not look great against Nebraska. We just saw Indiana absolutely work over that same exact team 1 week apart, and both of them were at home, similar situations. And yet you saw Ohio State trailing, late in that game where they needed to come back and win, and they don't budge. And more importantly, Indiana doesn't budge after that. Like that win to me looks more impressive, and what they did to Washington. It's incredibly frustrating to why they don't give the teams the respect they deserve 8 games through the year. I get it. It's 4 or 5 games in the season. You're like, they'll lose. But it drives me insane how they do not give these teams credit for winning football games. I'll throw Pitt in there as well, because not only did they win, but they won impressively. And again, that's an entire body of work that we were talking about. And they refuse to give them the credit that they deserve. And it gets very, very frustrating.
We talked about it Saturday night, Chip. I don't understand why voters are so allergic to rewarding, like Danny's saying, to rewarding teams for these starts. Because what's the worst thing that happens? They lose a game and then you move them down the next week. I agree with you on the Indiana point. I agree with you on Iowa State. It's just, to me, the most egregious is Pitt being 18. Pitt's 7-0. It's won 5 games against Power 4 teams. The 5 teams that it's beaten, they're not great, but I think West Virginia's 4-4. None of them have a losing record overall. So Pitt's beaten 5 Power 4 teams who are all 500 or better, and they can't get higher than 18th. They are behind LSU, who is 6-2. They're behind Boise State, who's 6-1, Alabama, who's 6-2. Like, you don't have to put them at number 3. You don't have to put them at number 5. But you can't put that team closer to the top 10 or in the top 10 ahead of a team like Tennessee, who hasn't really looked good in a month, ahead of Notre Dame, who looked great on Saturday, but still also has that Northern Illinois loss on its resume. It's nonsensical. It's silly. It's lazy. They're lazy. The voters are lazy. And I said it every week. They just sit there, and I get it. You got other stuff to do. You just move teams up and down based on where they were last week and what you saw they did on the scoreboard when you go check your, the box scores or whatever. But it's annoying.
I wonder if it's the laziness or they think it's predictive and they don't want to be wrong, or you know what I mean? Like, because I do think that because there's a lot of confusion between power rankings, which a lot of people do, and there's a place for that. And then there's rankings, which serve a huge purpose because they do impact who's going to play for our championship. And I know the AP doesn't count, and it's the College Football Selection Committee, but this is what drives me nuts. The selection committee sees these. They pay attention to these. It's not like they can be immune from seeing these rankings. And not to mention, when they tune in to watch as a casual, which they do, they see those rankings in front. So it does benefit the teams with the brands when they are playing a top 10 opponent or a top 15 opponent, when in reality, I don't think those teams should be there. And yet they get the benefit of the doubt. So again, I feel like I'm just beating a dead horse. The teams that don't have the brand recognition or come in with high expectations to start the season have to win twice as much, it feels like, to get the respect they deserve.
Do you think it is that power rankings mindset that
sort of some voters for sure, yeah,
excuse this? Because then they're like, all right, who would win on a neutral field? And I know the thing that's really, really I would say my number one gripe with the college football playoff is the insistence on that, like, best team, because you're really like being real dangerous about starting to flirt towards that. Like, all right, well then who would win on a neutral field?
It's ego.
Yeah.
People would rather rank teams based on what they think will happen rather than what has happened because of their ego.
Which, if all of us, I think we can agree on this, because as somebody who didn't want the expansion, you thought it would diminish the regular season. If we're going to do polls this way and rankings this way, then why even play at any games? If you're just going to say, who do we think the best teams are? But you're right, Chip. Saban already said last week that he thought we should use power rankings to select the teams, which is basically diminishing everything you do in the season. That's why, again, it's very confusing and people have a hard time, understanding the difference. Like when I was doing my ranking, I do my top 12 on Sunday, and mine is strictly based on what have you done. That's why I think I'm going to start calling it like if the season ended today, because then I had people pointing out Tennessee's schedule, and I'm like, well, their schedule hasn't been that tough. And they're like, well, moving forward, it's one of the strongest schedules in the country. I'm like, well, good. Then go win them, and guess what will happen? Yeah. You'll start to rise, and those other teams, they'll probably lose, and you'll end up in the end where you need to be. But it's incredibly frustrating. It's confusing, and there's no and what you asked, Chip, I don't know what all these voters think goes into their mind, but I'm trying to give them an out for how they could have, again, Miami, another one who came in with high expectations, historical brand. They haven't beaten a top 25 team. And if you compare them to Indiana, Indiana has been way more dominant against a similar schedule than Miami has been against theirs. And yet they're how many spots apart? It's just they should be in the same tier, right next to each other. Same with BYU.
Hey, you know where they are? At the CBS Sports 134. Let me give you some notable placements of those teams that you're discussing, because in the CBS Sports 134, which updated on Monday at cbssports.com, ballots from a pretty decent collection of CBS Sports and 24/7 sports experts. That would be Indiana at number 7. That would be Iowa State at number 8. And that would be BYU at number 9. That would be
have Pitt
14. Okay. I mean, you're dealing, and all of the jumps are happening as you continue to get deeper into the season with that 0 in the loss column, because it's impressive. It is really, really hard to go through a college football season without taking losses. And each week that you do it, it is worth rewarding because you have deserved it. And that's where, it's a full election season. Let me see if I can get gassed up right now. It is a dangerous thing for this sport if we do not reward what is deserved. And when we go too much to best and we don't focus on most deserving, then we make it so that the games are absolutely meaningless. So I think that we need to, at this point in the season, start to lean on most deserving when we go into ranking these teams. And for teams like Iowa State and BYU and Indiana, yes, you have deserved being celebrated and recognized with the higher ranking than teams that have higher power ratings, for teams that have more talent. And look, if, like Tom said, if they lose, boot them out. Because you know who dropped more than almost anybody else in the top 70 of the CBS Sports 134?
LSU.
Liberty. Because Liberty was only held up by that 0 in the loss column. And as soon as they took that loss to Kennesaw State, just end up falling way back in line. And you can do the same thing with these other squads.
Listen, early in the year, you want to go power ratings and hypotheticals. I get it, because you don't have a lot of data to work with. At this point of the year, a whole lot of data to work with. You can actually just start over and use your brain. I mean, most of the voters, I believe, went to college. You got some kind of education. They did teach you something.
They all went to Missouri and Northwestern.
Exactly. Why don't you start using it? You've got it.
I found another one that really bothered me.
Oh, good. Let's go.
Because, I don't know if people watch. That's what I'm wondering. Because Notre Dame, you're telling me they leapfrogged BYU? So they moved up 4 spots. BYU only missed up 2. So they, after watching a game where Navy turned it over 6 times, they basically handed the game to Notre Dame on a silver platter and said, here, beat us, put up 50 on us. That was not, and to Notre Dame's credit, they did. But BYU on the road was in complete command of that game and gave up 2 touchdowns in the fourth quarter that were kind of garbage time. So maybe they look at the score and they're like, maybe they weren't as dominant, but that was as dominant as what Notre Dame did against Navy. And I get the Navy's a top 25 team, but I think if you were listened here, we all would have watched and said, well, I think Notre Dame's going to have a pretty good physical advantage. And by the way, we just completely forgot about and lost to Northern Illinois, something that BYU did not do at any time this season.
And furthermore, like they're not ranked. So this is, but if you look at the also receiving votes, and they are ranked actually in the coaches poll, Memphis is at 25. So Navy, which was considered good enough to be ranked by both of these voting bodies last week, loses to Notre Dame, a team that they consider a top 10 team, and they get dropped behind Memphis on both of the polls, even though Memphis's only loss came to who? Navy. It's yeah, there's a lot of stupidity in here. Just people not thinking things through.
Let's see. Oh no, wait, here was it. Johanna jumped in about 45 minutes before we got started. What voodoo magic kept Mizzou and Illinois to stay in the top 25? And then also seems like there's some agreement on the BYU IU, but figured we'd take it on down to the 20s there. Illinois checks in at number 24. Missouri checks in at number 25.
I mean, Illinois is ranked 24. Well, what are you so mad about? Like, they're 6-2, and their 2 losses are a road loss to, let's see, they're 3, right? To number 3 Penn State and a road loss to number 1 Oregon. Can you imagine where an SEC team would be ranked if it was 6-2 with Illinois' resume? They'd be in number 10.
No, they'd be at Alabama. They'd be 14.
That's what I'm saying. They'd be 14. Like, what are we talking about? Mizzou, I think there's more of an argument for against them because they have played 2 ranked teams and they got spanked in them both. And their best win right now is Boston College or Auburn. So I definitely think there's more of an argument for Mizzou not being ranked, but at the same time, you can argue Vandy should still be ranked ahead of them. I guess you can argue Memphis, Tulane, Navy, but yeah, I don't know. The Illinois thing, I don't get. I think that's just people trolling because I'm on the show.
Oh, well,
I'm surprised they didn't keep Vandy in over Illinois. You know, they did play Texas tight.
They did play Texas tight.
I mean,
well, maybe that's more about Texas.
We can argue Vandy's case, but Vandy did also lose to Georgia State.
Correct.
There's a reason to keep them out too. So,
correct.
I mean, when you get to the bottom of the poll, who really cares? But again, Illinois' 2 losses are on the road to top 3 teams. If they're an SEC school, they're currently in the top 15, period, with the same exact schedule. Texas
dropped a spot to Miami. I know some Texas fans were up in arms about that. I don't have Miami's still undefeated.
I thought that was more about Miami than Texas.
Upset?
What? Yeah.
Texas fans were upset about dropping?
Yeah.
Did they watch the game against Vanderbilt? Like, did they see what Miami has done and has been doing? Oh, Texas, their fans are really hanging on to that Georgia loss, as that was so great about Georgia. I think it might be more about Texas than it was about Georgia.